This episode of The Construction Record is brought to you by the Ontario Sewer and Water Main Construction Association. Clean water is everybody's business.
Hello, welcome to another episode of the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey, and with me today I have this is not quite a different group of people, but it's not the usual group of people in that it is the usual group of people. I have with me
Russell Hickson, staff writer at the Journal of Commerce.
And Vince Versace, national managing editor of the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce. Long-time co-host on here, but it's been a while since I've been on.
Sure.
Right?
Very true. And the reason we're all coming together is because a big event happened this week. Specifically, the BC Prosecution Service said the loss of a critical witness and changes in testimony caused the Crown's case against construction giant Kiewit for the death of a worker in 2009 to collapse. They said there was a stay of proceedings that had been entered in the case against Peter Kiewit's sons, Timothy Rule and Gerald Karjala, I hope I got the name right, in a criminal negligence case causing death after Samuel Fitzpatrick was struck and killed by a boulder in 2009. Now, that's the preamble. Russ has been knee-deep in this story for years, honestly. So, Russ, why don't you take it away from here?
Yeah, there's been so many twists and turns with this case that we could talk about it for hours. I mean, the latest developments are twisty and turny. I mean, this isn't even getting into the fact that we had a defendant that was in the United States that had to be extradited. There's just so many things. I mean, the latest thing is that, the Crown's case collapsed. They announced that they couldn't move forward with the trial that was set for the 7th this month. It took 12 years to get to this point, and then just days before the trial, the Crown announces we can't convict. We don't think that we can get a conviction. And like you said, it was, a combination of bad luck and just waiting 12 years, I think. You had their star witness, who is a blasting and scaling and kind of rock expert, died suddenly in April. And they had to bring on a new expert who said, a lot of different things than what they thought they were going to say. And their case hinged on, that expert. And then also you had a bunch of witnesses who they did pre-trial interviews before a trial. They get everybody back together. They interview them again and kind of go through their statements. And they started saying different things. And they started remembering other things or changing what they said. And that creates this uncertainty that they cannot prove without a shadow of a doubt, which is the standard for this case. They just couldn't. And so they didn't move forward with prosecution.
Mm-hmm. And you also wrote another article about the industry reaction, which was swift to this I don't know, declaration, I guess, announcement.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've had a really strong movement from the steelworkers, who the victim, Sam Fitzpatrick, was not a member, but they don't care. They took on the case and they championed it because they advocate for workers. And they want the Westray Act to be enforced. That's their big thing, is they have a big national campaign called Stop the Killing. And they believe that government has this really powerful tool that they don't use to hold employers accountable for negligent workplace deaths, which is allegedly what happened here. Kiewit was fined one of the largest fines in WorkSafe BC history, and then they argued it down to $100,000. And the tribunal said you acted recklessly, with reckless disregard, for life. But all they got was about a $100,000 fine, and there will be no trial in the foreseeable future.
And Vince, we brought you in because you have some things to say about Westray and just from the Eastern perspective as well, for when these sorts of issues come up.
Yeah, well, it's kind of always been a personal interest of mine. When I started my reporting career as a journalist, like in Toronto dailies, labor and advocacy for safety on sites has always been a big deal. It permeates within our team too now. The Westray Act was such an important, for those of you that need the background on it, maybe you've heard about it. In 1992, there was a massive explosion at the Westray mine in Pictou, Nova Scotia, killed 26 people. 11 bodies were never recovered. The interesting thing with that was when you start to do the research, when you look at the research that was done, but what was reported, the amount of infractions and provincial stay orders and infractions that were levied against that project and the owners leading up to the day of the explosion was enough that should have caused that site to be shut down, should have been shut down. So they could have remediated the issue. The issue being this like flammable coal dust that was throughout the mine. That area when they announced that project, people had tried to coal mine there before, but issues around methane explosions was very commonly known because the last project was in the 50s and there were like 8 explosions at it, 6 to 8 explosions, if my memory serves right. So then they start up the mining again. And in 92, you have these deaths. But leading up to it, when you look at the case law, you look it up online, and I'll tie this back to what's happened to Mr. Fitzpatrick with Sam and what happened there with Kiewit. It's like you have noted inspections, you have noted incidents, right? That say that, you know what I mean, this is dangerous, especially with Westray. This should get fixed. There was an inspector that had been there just a week before saying this coal dust, this flammable coal dust should be removed, remediated. Then the questions start getting into why none of that was enacted.
Yeah, but it wasn't a surprise.
We're not surprised, right? Let's just say we're not here to try Kiewit on the podcast. I'm not here to retry the Westray case. We're just presenting the facts. But it's kind of like you see you hang around enough, you start to see the similarities of where things fall apart. And I think that's why, you know what I mean, probably the insight I wanted to bring on this podcast is, Russ, you've been following this.
Yeah.
Since it happened. One of the prime advocates, Mike Pearson, right?
Yes.
Why don't you tell us a bit more about Mike's involvement in this story? Because it ties into like how hard it is to get charges levied against an owner, right? Brought to the forefront, to even get a trial even considered.
Well, even to get the RCMP to investigate, which took like 6 years. So all the evidence, all the witnesses, everything sat for years and years and years. And so Mike Pearson is a friend of the family, the Fitzpatrick family. He was very close friends with Brian Fitzpatrick, who's the victim's father, Sam's father. And Brian advocated just for years, begged the RCMP, someone to investigate. He went to the steelworkers. His son was not a steelworker, but he begged the steelworkers to help. Anybody who would listen, he wanted justice for his son. And then he died in 2017, and he got to live and see the RCMP and the prosecutor, everybody say, like, we're going to look into this. We're going to do something about it. So he died knowing that. And Mike made him a promise. He said, I will not stop until you get justice. And for years, I've kept in touch with Mike, to get updates on the case and what's going on. And he's kept that promise. Mike has never stopped advocating for this case. And it's heartbreaking to see it get so close to going to trial and to have it fall apart. It's really upsetting for him, I'm sure.
It's funny when the news broke and you mentioned it to me. I thought about we have Norm Keith. He's a well-renowned Ontario labor lawyer, and now he works for KPMG. Used to be with Fasken Martineau. And Norm, over the last few years, penned different kind of columns for us in relation to the swing stage tragedy that happened here in Toronto in 2009, when 4 workers plunged to their death, from just about 11 stories. It was Christmas Eve. I went out that night, saw the bodies tarped over, the whole nine. I was there right from when the night had happened. So just like you with this story, I was on the ground, tied into it. So I would see what Mr. Keith would write about. And the development around charges for that case, because that was the big push to building trades here in Ontario, was like, okay, we got to get criminal charges against this owner or the supervisors, just like with Westray. Westray, the RCMP, it took a year before they brought then charges against the owner and 2 of the managers, as far as the Westray. And then when you looked at Metron, it's like, okay, they couldn't get criminal charges against the owner of the company, who was Joel Swartz. He got a $90,000 fine. He got away with no criminal charges were levied against him. But his company, Metron, was found criminally negligent, right? And they were fined $750,000, as was the swing stage company that was involved in that case. They were fined $350,000 in and around there. But the difficulty, like people were emboldened by the fact that, like, look, Westray, finally, the Westray Act, the amendments that make this criminal charge possible. Westray happened in 92. It didn't get legislated until 2004. It wasn't in legislation. So this tool that prosecutors and the police have to investigate accidents that happen in our industry, let's say, to see if there's any criminal charges to be brought ahead, it took forever. It took 12 years for it to come through. Yeah. Right. And we're back to the question around delay. How I got onto this was talking about Norm, because Norm Keith, in writing those columns around Metron as we pursued that, I remember I tried to look it up, so I'm just going to paraphrase it. But he said in one column, he's like, delaying a decision on criminal charges risks the case being thrown out for delay. He said a recent Supreme Court decision noted. So once again, we're talking about time and expediency and urgency, right? And trying to get evidence, trying to get statements. And there was we're not, like I said, we're not retrying this, but it's another example of this. There was quite a delay from one process to the other, right, Russ? From the investigation to when charges were laid. Right?
Yeah, and of course there was definitely stuff beyond the control of anyone. Like you had COVID, and then you also had one of the defendants, one of the Kiewit managers, is a U.S. citizen, and he was in the United States, and there was a whole complicated process of working with the United States and trying to get him back for trial. And going through that whole diplomatic process. But yeah, 12 years. I mean, do you remember what you did 12 years ago on a specific, on a Thursday?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so, and then you had the father die, and then you had, the star witness die, and just all this time it marches on, and this thing just kind of sits on the shelf. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of people are really, really frustrated. And what I've heard, too, is one of the big problems with the Westray Act is prosecutors and police, they don't like to do it because it's difficult. It's really difficult and complex to do an investigation and a prosecution under the Westray Act. And so my sources have told me that they often shy away from it, and they have to be pushed to do it because it's far easier to do an impaired driving case. It's far easier to do, a different case like that because the standard's just different.
I think you already answered my question, but what was the reluctance for using Westray, and why did it take so long to get legislated too? Because there seemed to be a lot of inertia there as well. Like, was there pushback?
It was legislated. It wasn't legislated
forever. Yeah.
It took a while. There was figuring out what happened because Westray itself. Here's the one thing: everybody throws out Westray. Some people do know that would know it. The charges were stayed in that case. In the end, nothing ever happened to those owners and those managers that were charged, right? Because by 95, the charges are stayed. The Crown has to break the news to those families, right? Because they would get together at the fire hall and talk and fill them in. It's like, well, the charges are stayed because of they were saying there was a neglect in the evidence, right? That the prosecution didn't share all the key evidence with the defendants. So charges stayed in 95. Supreme Court looks at it. There's two appeals to that decision. The Supreme Court then orders a new trial. But by 97, the Crown, once again, visits the families and says, there's no way we can prosecute this case. But the chances of conviction are slim and none. So things get dropped. So that's that first domino to try getting something started to hold somebody accountable. You know what I mean? So owners don't get away with, like, that was 26 people, 26 families, devastated, right? So you look at the 97 to 2004, it's like that's 7 years for a piece of legislation. You know what I mean? A tool to be crafted so that can be used by folks. And it got roped into an omnibus bill. It wasn't even like a standalone thing. It was part of something else. Right. So, when we talk about the reluctance, it's like I mentioned Norm Keith, like last fall, another column for us saying, you know what, it's slow. Because there was no charges or anything that came out of Westray. This is his professional opinion, which I'm paraphrasing, right? Maybe we'll add the link to this particular column in the show notes for people. He was saying that it's just like, because nothing happened, it's only now we're starting to see that case law and that tool being tested really, right? But it ties into, because it's so foreign in a way, it's hard. It's hard for prosecutors and police to take it seriously, like you're saying, Russ. I've heard the same thing anecdotally and on background from folks. even when we're covering Metron. It's like, well, I don't know, cops aren't equipped to do this. Or if they are, like, what priorities do they have, right? Versus murders, drugs, everything else. And you know what I mean? Well, then you got these workplace fatalities, right? You would hope that authorities try their best with the resources they have. So we're back to this. It's like, it's there. The unions get happy about it when it gets used. Like we had I was trying to do a little background report, and the last time we saw an owner charged with anything else, we had a Quebec excavation contractor back in 2019. The owner was charged, I'll get this right. He was manslaughter, because of a trench collapse that killed one of his workers. Thing is, he was in the trench too. So imagine trying to argue that case, right? Like his negligence sort of thing, but he was in the line of fire as well, right? Imagine the questions that had to be placed there by legal.
Yeah. Go
ahead, Russ. Yeah.
Well, I mean, in this case, so it's not as simple as, I mean, here's the facts of the case that are not disputed, right? Mm-hmm. It's you had a site where the day before Sam was killed, a massive boulder fell down in the area where he was going to be working and destroyed like a compressor, like a major piece of equipment. So they had a site meeting and they said, okay, what do we need to do? And they said, well, we can't do what's called stacking. So having workers work above each other where they might disturb rock and have it fall down. And so if you deviate from that, so you have to, for the Westray Act, for you to prove it, and again, I'm not a lawyer, so this is me paraphrasing, my best understanding, is you have to prove that there was like a prevailing knowledge of like, this is what we do under normal circumstances. This is like the common sense thing to do. And you have to prove that executive officers with the company decided to deviate from that, and that caused the incident. And then, of course, you have dispute over, well, where was the excavator working above them? Is it technically stacked? Is that because there was dispute over that? Or where did the boulder actually come from? Because a big dispute in this was this just a freak incident of freezing and thawing where a boulder just happened to come loose and strike the person? That's just kind of a freak accident, a freak incident. And then you get into all this kind of noodly stuff. Well, what is the prevailing wisdom of how you handle this situation at a workplace? And did they even deviate from it? And it gets very technical. But the facts is they knew boulders were rolling down and smacking into stuff there, and they decided to have people work there anyways. Mm-hmm. That's not disputed. That's what happened.
Yeah, it reminds me with the Metron case. I talked about Metron and swinging staff and the fines they got, and Joel Schwartz not getting criminal charges. There were criminal charges laid against a supervisor who was on that swing stage that broke apart. You know what I mean? Like he got 3.5 years of prison time, and it was that. It's like what maybe Joel Schwartz, the owner, didn't know what they would do with these swing stages, but the investigation showed. It's like, you know what, really bad practices. That the supervisor was kind of turning his eye away from them. Right. Okay, that makes him culpable. But to go up the chain beyond him and make that connection to get the owner to get him, quote unquote, as some of the trades would say, right?
Sure.
It was hard and a burden that the prosecution couldn't take on.
Yeah. And in this case, I mean, the experts, the expert that died and then the new expert disagreed with like the likely cause of what caused the rock to fall, and even what the best practices may be for handling a situation like that. I don't know what's going to happen. For Westray cases have been done better. Like they've been more successful outside of BC. I'm not sure what it is about BC that makes it like this, because they had another case in New Westminster, BC, where there was a sawmill death. Mm-hmm. And again, the prosecution failed. They stayed the case. It's just very rare in BC to have successful Westray prosecutions, I guess.
That was going to be my next question, which is, where does the industry go from here? Like, this is immediately demoralizing, which we saw in your story. But further down the road, if you want to go into the trades and you see, well, nobody's got my back if something bad happens, as a worker, what do you think?
I mean, I think you need people who specialize in this. I think you need prosecutors and RCMP people who specialize in criminal workplace investigations and prosecutions, because I think it's like a specialized kind of law and investigation process. What do you think, Vince?
I agree. It's like, okay, all three of us here have a history of reporting commercially, like for city papers and community papers. And I'm
Yeah.
sure you and I have never compared notes on this, but I'm sure you've heard it just like I used to hear it here in the city, right? In Toronto, it's like, well, you can't have a police officer in every corner. You know what I mean? We can only have so many officers, you know what I mean? And even if we did, crime would still happen,
Sure.
right? So when I think about that as an extension, kind of the exaggerated examples, like having specialized units that would do this, I get it. It's hard. You know what I mean? To have enough people to do everything, but something has to be there to arm law enforcement a bit better, to do these investigations better, and also to give the prosecutions a chance. Now, once again, I'm sure somebody's listening to us going, well, why are you going after the owners? Why are you going after the owners, right? We're talking about death on a site. You know what I mean? We're talking about workers dying. And the one thing we all can categorically say here at the DCN and JOC is, if other people in other professions died at the frequency and in the ways people die in this industry that we cover, we would see movement. We would see specialized units on every corner. You know what I mean? To avoid this, right? Construction guys die. Oh, it's a dangerous job. Yes. And no one's forcing them to do it, but some of them are kind of forced to do it. It's the only thing that they can do, right? But that doesn't mean their life is less, you know, and that's what gets my blood boiling a little bit, right? Every time we write these stories and we do these things around these guys that die, these family men, family women, you know what I mean, on site. And who has their back, to use your term? Who has their back in this, right? They're not disposable lives, right? And you know what I mean? But it just doesn't seem to be. Go ahead, Warren. Yeah.
And it's not like safety associations or WorkSafe BC or their Ontario equivalent thereof. It's not like they're not trying their best to have this happen, but there seems to need to be more.
Yeah. Need to be more. What is it? You know what I mean? Like you see, to believe an expert like Norm Keith, he's like, yeah, okay, we're starting to see some of these convictions of the owners, right? Criminal charges being successfully seen through, right? And that's a victory. At the same time, in one column, he's like, you know, there's a bunch of other stuff that gets thrown out. You know, so it's not always successful all the time.
I mean, you know? I don't think it takes a genius to look at something. Like any normal person, if I told you, you're aware of an extremely dangerous, life-threatening situation, and you have power over somebody, and you send them to go there, and regardless, you say it's dangerous over there, you could die, but you need to go do stuff over there anyways. That's wrong. I mean, I'm sorry. Like any reasonable person could come to that conclusion. Is if you tell people to do stuff that you know for a fact is dangerous, I don't think that's okay. And there needs to be a willingness to address that legally, right? And we have the tools, but they're rarely used. And I know sources I've talked to say there's just not training, that people aren't well versed in how to do these kinds of cases. But I mean, whether you die in a car on your way to work or you die at work, there should be just as much effort to get justice. Just because you're at work shouldn't change that.
No.
The only thing I can think of that's, and this is a bit of a reach, is the military, where you have to order people to do expressly that, and they have an entire different system of justice because of that. We can't do that, obviously, but you know, civilian life can't do that. But maybe there's an in between there somewhere where, like you said, there's more emphasis on this, because you're right, they are sending people. They don't want them to go, but they're sending them in a dangerous situation, I guess is the best way to put it.
Like, it's an inherently dangerous industry. Building is, you know what I mean? Look at the different aspects of it. Having grown up in a construction family with a carpenter dad who was injured on site a couple of times, right? You know, lucky enough that it wasn't never fatal. Like, and the man was walking on a staircase and it collapsed at a site. My dad fell, like, I don't forget how many feet down, you know, just with a broken ankle, and that was it.
Yeah.
We could have lost him that day, right? Dangerous. And that was him just walking at the end of the shift, kind of leaving, right? And that happens. But every death, you know, sometimes it is a worker decision, though. At the same time, though, right? Like we recently had a story in the DCN side about an elevator tech. I know the inquest finally finished and the recommendations came out. And we talked, Angela Gismondi talked to the gentleman's sisters. And the gentleman's sister's message was, look, we never looked at the inquest as a thing about blame. We understood our brother did something wrong that day. It was more about getting the recommendations out there for, hey, if you're an elevator tech doing this type of elevator work, you have to avoid these mistakes because it took our brother's life, right? Like, so that there's a maturity and a nuance to that discussion, right? It's not all about, you know what I mean? There are some levers in place to help improve situations, right? But when we're looking for justice and charges and getting jail time, yeah, you're getting into a different type of nitty gritty that's not really doesn't seem to have momentum in the system right now. It just doesn't, right?
Yeah, and I think another important thing to highlight is, and this is a good thing, is you have the right to refuse unsafe work. And I know that's easy to say, and it's more difficult when you have the pressure of a career and a job and an employer, and they need to get stuff done. But I think that's important to say. Is like let's say you're on a site where they're doing rock scaling work, blasting work, and there's boulders coming down the day before, and they tell you you need to go in there, you need to work. You have a right to put up your hand and say, no, I don't think it's safe. And you cannot be retaliated against. You cannot be punished for that. And I think that's a really powerful thing, a powerful tool that workers have that they can use.
Oh, right. So I don't know, to answer in the end, where do we go from here? You know what I mean? I guess we keep an ear to the ground for our point of view. Is just look at what the industry's doing. What's the fallout of this? I'm curious, because though a BC story does national implications, right?
Well, I know in BC we had fallout from, the 2 sawmill explosions, and the failure to prosecute those because the investigation was bungled. They didn't do a proper criminal investigation, and that led to a bunch of reforms. And this even dovetails into what we're talking about now, because there was a report by someone named Lisa Helps, and they did there was a whole string of reports around the sawmill explosions and how WorkSafe BC and the province and RCMP and everybody needs to do these investigations in a way that they can be properly prosecuted. And one of the major recommendations was there needs to be training of RCMP and other people of how to prosecute and investigate these cases, because they're complex.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, if our readers listeners today, if you catch this podcast, we have a package of content, a lot of Russ's great work and coverage around this that's getting pulled together. That's going to be published on Friday. So beyond just listening to us, if you want a bit more context, maybe we'll make sure as well in the show notes to just get some links in there to some of the stuff so you get a better picture. And
Yeah, for sure.
Anybody has any questions or commentary? You know what I mean? Let us know, right, Russ? Like, we're gonna try to contact some more people. We're not just leaving this now, right?
No.
We still have plans around this.
Yeah, if you want to write a column, if you're a legal expert, or you just want to talk about labor in general, yeah, we're going to keep covering this. We're going to keep on this. This is something that's not going to go away. I mean, just in North Vancouver, just the other week, we had a demolition site, a collapse, and a worker died there. And we're going to find out. I mean, of course, there's no information about what exactly happened there. But my point is workers die all the time in construction, and there's going to be more incidents that are looked into and investigated, and maybe there are more charges, and we need to figure out how we handle that. Because we can't wait 12 years and then have a case collapse just before trial, right?
And my thing too sometimes is this is not me trying to play both sides, but I'd not love to see the trial go forward and see the evidence tried, right?
Yes.
To actually get to that stage, I think, for some would be satisfactory enough. You know what I mean? It's like it's not just face value. You know what I mean? That we got the charges done, right? It's like actually seeing it through. And hey, if the person gets absolved, they get absolved somehow in that case. If they're guilty, they're guilty. Yeah. But to see the arc finished, you know what I mean?
I think to have the finality of having your day in court, even if it doesn't go the way you want, I think that would be satisfying. I mean, I've sat through many trials. I know you, Vince, probably have. I used to be a crime and courts reporter, and I sat through many murder trials, rape trials, high-level criminal trials, and there was a sense of kind of finality, like this is it, like we're done. And sometimes it goes the way you want, sometimes it doesn't. But at least everybody gets their say.
Okay, so if anybody wants to read more about this, and we will certainly be talking more about this, at least in print form, if not, again, in podcast form, you can check it out at the Daily Commercial News and the Journal of Commerce. And if you want to listen to us, we're on Amazon Music, Spotify, and Apple Music, or on the aforementioned websites. Vince and Russell, thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
This episode of The Construction Record is brought to you by the Greater Toronto Sewer and Water Main Contractors Association. Clean water, our goal, our future.